Well, good morning, Gathering Network kids, and welcome back to Kid Zone. I am so glad you are here today. Last time when we were together, we wrapped up the story of Moses and we dipped into a little bit of the next leader that God had for the Israelites, and his name was Joshua. We learned that when Joshua took over, God gave him some very, very odd plans for taking over Jericho and helping the Israelites settle into their new home after 40 years in the desert. Jericho was a huge walled city, like a fortress, well protected and nearly impossible to break into. The big question for everyone was, would Joshua and the Israelites listen to God and do what he says, even though it was kind of weird? Joshua gathered his army together, and they had their swords and their spears and their shields. They were ready for a fight to try to take over Jericho. But God's plan that he had for them was not about fighting. It was about trusting him and doing what he said. Joshua's army went marching and marching and marching around the city day after day after day. They had to have looked so silly to be all dressed up for this battle, but all they were doing was marching around the city. Even the people in Jericho were teasing them and taunting them and saying, "They're too scared for a fight. Look at them." But the people of Jericho were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. So they marched around the city in this way for 7 days in a row. Can you even imagine what that would be like? Thousands of people dressed and ready for battle, marching around Jericho for an entire week. It had to have looked ridiculous, really. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city not once, but 7 times. And God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. So imagine like the Chiefs Stadium filled with 40,000 people yelling and screaming as loud as they possibly could. It certainly would have hurt their ears, but it also started to cause damage to those fortress walls of Jericho. Those huge, strong walls crumbled to the ground as if they were made of sand. It's really something that only God could have done. It was this way that God's people entered into what would become their new home. They didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk. Joshua told them, God has brought you safely here. After 40 years in the desert, he has provided for you again and again and again. He has taken care of you. And Joshua challenged them with this question. He says, will you now do what he says? And the people all unanimously, they agreed, yes, we promise we are going to do what he says. He has provided for us. But as we're going to continue to find out throughout the rest of the scripture story, they were unable to keep this promise once again. They didn't do what God said, and many years later, just as God kept trying to warn them, things were going to go badly for God's people. They would lose their home. Enemies would capture them and take them back into slavery. God's people would be scattered across many different lands instead of living in this one home that God had provided. But God's plan was still at work, and one day he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home would be one that no one would ever take from them. So today, take some time with the discussion questions about Joshua and Jericho, and we will be back next week as we start into a new storyline in the scriptures about David.